It is March. It is gonna be rainy season. I wish it would rain the entire month because we don't get a chance from April on here in Santa Barbara. We live in the desert. And you've got how many feet of snow?
We're down to about two. We've had fairly warm weather.
Did you just put some in a FedEx box and send
And just send
it?
it to you. Yeah, get one of those little like styrofoam coolers and
I remember they
send to
talked
FedEx.
once about just breaking off a chunk of iceberg and floating it down the Pacific coast and then, putting a big pipe on it or something so you could get the.
Isn't it wild the way weather works?
Oh, oh, geez. Well, there's a show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
really.
weather's amazing. Um, there's this. Speaking of weather, and my background in computers and computer animation. There is. I forget the guy's name. I apologize, but he created a digital model of the Earth assembled from satellite photographs, where he selected photos that had no clouds. So
Mm,
this was a way to study the earth and you could rotate
hmm
it around and zoom in and
hmm
do whatever you wanted, but there was never any clouds obscuring it. And I never noticed that until I was at a museum opening of one of our guys had done some work and there's earth. The guy says, there's no clouds on that earth. And I went, huh, you're right. So there's an earth with no weather.
Wow. Well, it's interesting that there he could find enough photos of
Yes.
open spaces and
Yeah.
put them together that way.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
We have a couple of satellites up there.
So we were talking right before we started recording about our fathers,
Yeah. Yeah.
and actually an interesting piece that I didn't say while we were just chit-chatting is I've been contacted by a person to do a podcast on the effect of fathers and families and in child rearing.
He's Dewey Freeman. I'm Mark Sylvester. This is the Elder Council. And yesterday I got to go down to celebrate a friend of ours, a lovely woman who is in the Navy Medical Corps getting commissioned as a captain, which is a big deal in the Navy. And she got to pick where she was commissioned, and she wanted to be on the bow of the USS Midway, which is basically it's a aircraft carrier, looks like a floating airport. And imagine being on the bow of this amazing huge ship with the view of the Coronado Bay and all of San Diego. It was spectacular, and it it triggered several memories, military memories for me. I went to
Mm-hmm.
military academy when I was in fourth and fifth grade. My dad was Navy, and I'm looking up at what they call the island. So that's that big console that comes off, and that's where the bridge is, and all that stuff's still moving. Everything's still working, which is kind of cool. But my dad, and here's what's interesting. I did not learn this until the service we had for him here in Santa Barbara when he passed away a few years ago. My brother told a story about how dad was a cook in the Navy, but he wasn't just a cook, he was the cook for the executive officers. So he was up there cooking for them. And I'm a cook, I'm a chef. And I never knew that about my dad. And he never spoke about his service other than when we were growing up, he had a tiger tattooed on his arm. And his fun thing that made him giggle when we were little, is he'd make it growl and we would jump. But it wasn't until he was 90 and we went to his house, my wife and I in Henderson, and for some reason he pulled out the yearbook from those times. I guess they made a yearbook with
Really?
pictures of all the men that were commissioned on that ship.
And
And
what ship was he on?
I don't remember. It wasn't huge. It was all of this history that I didn't know, but I was really proud that he was in the Navy. And one of my favorite pictures is him when he's 19. He lied about his age to get in. He was 17 and he got in. And I've got a picture of him on the boat that is just spectacular. It
That's
reminds
amazing.
you of Jack Kerouac or some,
Hmm.
yes, young, I'm going to go and join the Navy.
That's really interesting because um, when I have some other questions, but the parallels are interesting. That's actually exactly what my dad did.
Mm.
He lied about his age in World War II, going into World War II. He was in the Navy, he was in the Pacific, um, and it actually affected his life a lot. Um, and a huge part of at least one of my regrets is that I didn't know that much about it, even though I'd asked.
Oh,
Um,
you would ask.
yeah, and I knew snippets, um, but I didn't know. Um, I didn't know details. I didn't know, what his experience was. He just would not talk about it.
I
And I don't
I
know,
remember one
was that similar
story.
with your dad or?
Yeah, I was not raised by my dad. I saw him once a year growing up, or twice a year. I saw him at the company picnic. He'd fly down from Boeing in Seattle to the company, and there'd be company picnics. So I'd see him then and see him at Christmas. He'd come pick us up on Christmas morning and drive down to see his family, whether it was in Pasadena or down in Laguna Niguel. And I didn't have that much time, right? But I
Mhm.
remember one story told me, the landing craft that come up to the shore and the front folds
Mhm.
down and everybody comes out. Well, what you don't see, what I had never seen before, is as they're approaching the shore break, 8 guys jump out, 4 on each side, with about 100 yards of thick rope.
Mhm.
And they go out, and their job is to hold the ship straight so it doesn't turtle in the wave.
Mhm.
And he was one of those guys. So now I'm thinking, there's incoming fire. We've seen the movies, and they're the first out. I mean, the whole idea of that big deal is that it protects you from fire. Yet now we've got 8 guys who've jumped into the water. And I was just thinking how brave that was. Did he also volunteer to do that? Or is like Sylvester, get in the water, grab a rope?
I was probably more Sylvester get in the water and grab a rope. That this is so fun because my father he did two things in the war, and uh, one he was on an island in the middle of the Pacific called Baker Island,
Mm,
which on one of my flights to Australia we flew right over Baker Island, and I got to see the island from the air, which was a dramatic moment for me. It
I
brought up
bet. Oh gosh.
so many feelings and so much, uh, actually a lot of tenderness
Mm,
and even a level of closure that I did not expect to have. And so, but part of his job was they would go into different islands, but Baker Island was the main one, and build temporary landing strips for
it was
aircraft
like the
that would.
what the Sea Bees did, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
And his other job was a diesel mechanic for landing craft.
Ah,
So um, that's
wow, wow, wow.
that's
Huh.
what he did, and the um, and part of the job was at times they would um, there would be like these gigantic like puzzle pieces that were I don't know even how big they were. I guess that'd be interesting. I should do some research on that. But they all link together to build a landing strip.
Oh, right.
And
Right.
and he would part of his job with the landing craft was actually taking crews and some of that equipment in to be able to build landing strips. Um, and that's interestingly enough, that's about all I know, even though I had asked him many times, Dad, what was it like and what did you do? And he
It,
just
I've heard stories, I mean, other than your and my direct experience, that coming home from the military has so much. It's just so much, and add the trauma of war to that, and seeing your buddies killed, and all of the things, being injured yourself, but all of the things that happen, and that the initial response, or the response of at least two fathers, yours and mine, was to not talk about it. And with as many men over the years, the tens of thousands who've been in war and come home and try to reintegrate at home with the families,
Mhm,
is phenomenally difficult. And so I'm back in the day, OG with our dads was just, I'm not talking about it. Shut up. I don't want to talk about it. Right. And now I think we have a more enlightened view of wellness and therapy, and talking, and there's more resources. I met the guy at TED who was in charge of that reintegration for the Marines. He worked
mhm,
out of DC, and so his job was working with the VA and putting together the programs at Camp Pendleton. So when guys came back, how did you get them to move on into civilian life?
mhm. Well, what's interesting to me is I'm still not sure that there's that much openness around sharing and talking. Um,
Agreed.
and um, which to me, that sort of breaks my heart
Mm,
in that, and I know that there's some just I know this because I have some very, very close friends who are ex-military and from all different branches. And I've also worked with a bunch of people from like Navy SEALs and and Green Beret and a lot of the Special Forces Air Force people and I think there's an underlying feeling that people would not get it.
mm,
And
absolutely.
and there may be some truth to that. I'm not suggesting that there isn't truth to that. But I would also suggest that people would get at least a significant part of what happened. And um, and I know that I have gotten a significant part of what has happened. And when men and women talk to me about this, so but that the whole piece of feeling like there's no place to go, which is
Yeah.
exactly what I know that my dad felt, because as he got older and was very ill, he actually said that
Mm.
there's no place to go. Nobody wants to hear. Nobody wants to listen. It's over. Um,
What's interesting, and it's interesting to me, I'm just going to take a second. It's almost always the case when it hits me what we're really talking about is about 30 minutes into our conversation.
yes,
This yesterday, as I was driving home, it's a hike from Santa Barbara to San Diego. We live in the middle of the state. It's at the bottom of the state. We went down, were there for an hour, and came home. It was a long day and lots of time to think on the way back in traffic. And what I wanted to talk about today, which we finally got to, is the quote: "Most men lead lives of quiet desperation."
pretty heavy duty quote.
Yeah.
Do you know where that came from?
I don't. I didn't Google it when I got home. I will, and I'll put it in the show notes. And I can relate to that, and I'm not in the military. I think it's a thing with us, with men, and I'm sure you can validate that. And I'm looking forward to hearing that. That the I don't have anybody to talk to, no one will understand, and that that's terrible. I mean, it's overwhelming. There isn't a word big enough. Let's put it that way. There isn't a word big enough for the um, aloneness is not a word, but the feeling of being alone is it's debilitating. It's crushing. It's overwhelming. It's quiet desperation.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a desperate solitary process that many men feel like cannot be penetrated, and many men, I think, actually perpetuate that.
Explain
And
that. Explain that sentence.
when I hear a man say that I don't have anybody to talk to, or I don't have anybody to call, there's actually a video that I show when I teach uh, with Traver on a program on how to work with men that literally is maybe a minute and a half of probably 20 to 25 young men going. And the question is who do you have to call if you need
Mm,
someone to call?
mm, mm.
And all of the answers is I can call somebody. I didn't know I could call somebody. You know, people don't want to know my feelings. People don't want to know what I've gone through. And that's that feeling and that process, I think, is true, is that there are people that don't want to hear from men. I also think that the perspective of that there's nobody to talk to leads to a process of men not feeling like it's possible for them to take the risk to speak. So so they don't. Um,
And
and
and this is up and down the food chain of capabilities of men. So it's right. So it's men who are could be, very forthcoming, very, willing to talk, but that there are some things that just I can't talk. I guess there's a difference between I can't talk about it and I don't have anybody to talk to. I'm confusing the two. I'm conflating
no,
the two, and
actually,
I
I think
shouldn't.
both of those are there.
So you might have someone to talk to, but you don't feel like you could talk to them.
Yeah, mostly because what I have both experienced and seen with men is that if I talk, I will lose my masculinity. If I talk, I will be judged. If I talk, I won't be able to continue. If I talk, I'll
Oh,
reach this underlying uh, depth of grief or sadness or hurt that I won't be able to come out of. Um, if I talk, I will be judged. If I talk, I will be um, seen as less of a man. If I talk, I'll be seen as just a victim that's whining. Um, all of those kinds of internalized messages that in some way those messages are out there. Those are true.
sure, sure.
People get shut down. And um, and the and let me give you an example. And actually, you're right. It's like we begin, and it's like we begin with one idea and we wind up somewhere else. I teach a 3-day class with men and civilized on how to work with men in therapy. And it's for therapists and coaches. It's one of the most intense classes that I teach, and one of the responses in that class are incredibly intense, sometimes gut-wrenching responses for people. In one of the classes, this is about 6 or 8 months ago, one of the things that we talk about in each class is men and men's sexuality. And we began this particular discussion with just being opening it up to say, and there are both men and women in this group, because part of what my perspective is women therapists really need to learn how to work with men. That's a really important piece. And men need to have really good women therapists as well as really good male therapists. And so we just open it up and to say, what do you struggle with for the men in the room? What do you struggle with around sexuality? And the biggest response was, I want to be desired. I want to be wanted.
Mm, mm, mm.
And a number of men, and men that I know who are very together, very grounded, they've done a lot of work. Numbers of them spoke that. One of the women who is a therapist um, asked a question, and I thought it was a very good question, and it was done in a very good way. What her question was to the men is, as a woman therapist, what can I do to help you work with this, or what do you need from me as a therapist to be able to dive into this? And there was an immediate, and I did not expect this
Mm,
reaction, to
mm,
be honest about it. There was an immediate reaction of fear. Of a couple men were angry. A couple men were going, "Oh my God! If I share that, I will be so vulnerable
mm.
that it will hit my core." And it was actually, it was heavy duty, and nobody was faking anything. This was
Right.
her
I've
question
been
was,
in those sessions
yeah,
where you hold a space that is it's the tension of a bubble, right? A bubble is held together and it could break really quick. And
Bing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I've been in those. Because I remember an initiation we did in Austin that was the only one I had been to. And at the time when the men are talking and they feel safe and they feel supported and they feel held and loved and they can do that. And they were telling horrific stories that they'd never told before.
Exactly.
And, so to that point, we're not in situations, or we don't put ourselves or willingly put ourselves in situations where we can even talk and break through that. I know with Kimberly in the first year, I remember very specifically, I was not happy. I was upset. I don't remember what it was, and I would just like this,
Mm.
shields up, right? And she was the first woman to say, that's not acceptable. You don't get to do this. I'm your partner. I'm the one that you can talk to. I'm the one. And it took probably a half an hour of convincing me that my behavior my entire life, which was to clam up, was what a not gonna work. That was if I wanted to be with her, I couldn't be that guy. We had to
I
be able to talk.
exactly.
And
And I know Kimberly well enough to I can just see this.
well, the other thing is that in the when we were dating, I was riding a bike at the time, and I would ride all over Santa Barbara, and I would and this my favorite song that made me think of her was, and everybody's gonna have to look this up except you, was Cat Stevens. I'm looking for a hard-headed woman, one that will make me do my best.
Yep.
And that it took that. No, she wasn't giving up, and I wasn't giving in.
Yep.
And it took, I'm just thinking of her metaphorically, cracking, and not be just like, no, I'm going to stay here. And that's true love, right? Where you're just
Hmm.
like, hey, we got to get through this. So something was telling her to stay with it. Something was telling me to stay with it because I didn't. And that happened early enough, very, very, very early in the relationship, that's how we live. I don't get, and it's actually very liberating, but that was a bitch to go through.
It is one of the most scary things to go through. It's one of the most scary things to, I mean, what's interesting, and I'm going to take some liberty here, but I know that, I mean, you and Kimberly were dating, you weren't just friends. And it's like we many times allow ourselves to be naked physically and go, okay, now I'm open and I can do that. But when we then don't allow ourselves but to be naked emotionally. And it's like, yeah, we can be naked physically, no big deal. No worries about that one. But what about being naked emotionally? What about what about taking the uh, armor off of our hearts?
Mm,
And I often talk about the idea of undressing our hearts,
mm,
because when we're in relationship, not every relationship obviously, but when we're in a lovership relationship with a woman, we're literally taking our clothes off at times.
mm,
And it's like, can we do that with hearts and our souls.
So the person who stayed with us for 40 minutes here, listening and probably answering the question, no, I haven't, or I don't know how, or oh my gosh, I wish I could do that. How do they do that? What's the call to action? How do how do you stay with the metaphor? How do you unbutton that first button?
Right. I want to answer that. And are you willing? You're sharing about you and Kimberly early on. What did Kimberly do that was so
She,
helpful for you to get where you got?
um,
And then what did you do?
so it's interesting how seared in my brain this is. We were sitting on the bed, looking. It was facing the deck, and she didn't get up. I would say relentless in the sense that she like gave me space to be upset because I was upset. I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember what it was at all. It kind of didn't matter. And I remember her like touching me, right? So maybe her hand was on me somehow. She wasn't
Like
hugging
on
me,
your
but
shoulder, on your back, something like
or
that.
maybe on my something like that. So there was
Mm-hmm.
a physical connection, but it was reassuring that and recognizing I did not want to do that and holding space for that, right? I didn't know that's what it was called, but and I think it felt primal. It didn't feel, she's not trained in any of that, right? I think it was just an inclination that this person needed to break through this stuff, and her motivation was she couldn't have me not deal with stuff. Like it was really important to her that I was able to deal with stuff. So with my stuff, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
got that, and and knowing that she wasn't going to leave, like I was not able to get up and exit this, disassociate from the situation. That was
Right.
not going to happen. That was clear. It was made clear that it will sit here until this is done. So the sooner you hit the shields down button, I'm making light of it now, but it
The sooner
was,
we'll get through.
I think it was knowing that she was there, knowing she wasn't going to go away, knowing it was okay, knowing that that didn't affect her love for me, knowing that in
She was
fact,
actually there because of her love for you.
yes, exactly. And you, there are few moments in our lives, few moments that are that deep and emotionally packed, and that was an early seminal one. And and it's interesting, I haven't thought it was easily 20 years ago.
So let me speak to that because that's what you're sharing is a really big deal. And actually, my Kimberly and I have had similar, excuse me, similar kinds of moments. One of the two things that come to mind, actually three things, is the strength of Kimberly because she's very strong in all ways. Part of that strength comes from that she's gone through some very difficult times and come out okay. But the other part is she came in with strength and what I would say is relentless kindness.
Mm, yes. Yeah.
And I, again, I mean, for the audience, like, you know, my Kimberly, I know your Kimberly, we're all friends with each other. And I know your Kimberly well enough I know that relentless kindness. I know her capability of that. And um, because that inner wounding, and this even goes right back to what I was talking about in this class on working with men, is the only way to handle that. Because it was one of the more challenging things I've experienced as a teacher. It was really volatile. And was a steadiness and a relentless kindness with, and the kindness isn't like, oh, I'll let you get away with this. The kindness is, we're on the same team. We need for us to remain on the same team, and it's not a threat, but for us to continue on the same team, we need to have
Remember,
that.
remember we talked this many, many, many shows ago about we talk about we talked about it last week, the contract we have with one another, right? And that was kind of it. Well, okay, well, paragraph 2, section G says you don't get to clam up, right?
Right.
Right. That's part of the contract, part of the rules. I'm cognizant of our time, and we've kept our audience's attention for a while. What could we leave them with? And then I have a little bit of closing on my dad. What could we leave them with? The ones who have felt, man, either I don't have someone who's being relentlessly kind to me, or I need to find someone who could be relentlessly kind, or maybe I need to be relentlessly kind with myself.
Exactly. And what can we leave people with that? Is the big thing I would say is that courage
Mm.
is, it takes a huge amount of courage to be vulnerable. Brene Brown talks about that. It takes a huge amount of courage to be vulnerable. I think it takes even more courage to be kind.
Name of the show, Courage to be Kind. I would normally leave it right there, but I do want to tell you one thing about my dad that I've loved my
Definitely
whole
want
life.
to
One
love it.
thing. On my 21st birthday, he gave me the Sylvester family tree.
Mm,
There were some cousins of his or uncle, I don't know who, I don't remember, but it was in the 50s when they retired. They traveled the United States looking for relatives, but the records of relatives. So they went to churches and schools and city halls and
really?
that kind of
Wow.
thing, and they compiled this, and it's, I don't know, it's 50 pages all hand typed. And my brother got one and I got one. And the last entries are the 10th generation, which was in the 50s.
Okay.
And I've had it for years, knowing I was going to give it to my grandkids. That was
Hmm.
that was the deal. And this week I took and I scanned it and I fed it into my AI to be able to reformat it, not add anything, but just reformat the whole thing, figure out the generations, figure out um, what the beginning, who was the first person in a generation and the last person to be born in a generation, from one, which was in 1634, to 13, which is my grandkids, and and then I also had it do a little bit of historical stuff in there for those generations, just get a sense. But along around the 20s, they got more information. Like generation one was like this, generation two like this, generation 8 and 9 were several pages long. Mayors, politicians, business owners, all just all kinds of people. And I also had it calculate. I love this because I'm old. I had it calculate the average age by generation, and we live into our between 85 and 95 years is the average age of people, Sylvesters.
Very cool.
And so I put it all together, and I remember also my dad had our family crest made sometime over the years and sent my brother and I each one of those. So I put that on the front page, and then we've got a family chat that has, my brother and his kids and me and my kids and the grandkids. And so I posted in there and to kind of update things. And I found I have one cousin that I can get in contact with, and hopefully she'll be a gateway to that whole side.
How sweet is that?
And having that history back 13 generations gives me a profound sense of belonging.
Yes. Which is just things always wrapped around and together. So there's that piece, which thank you for sharing that. That is, I'm sitting here going, I would love that. I actually have a cousin who's done that, which I may contact her. But the other is that's actually what Kimberly gave to you that night, sitting on the edge of the bed, is a profound sense of belonging.
Thank you for closing us up perfectly, Doc. I appreciate it. I love you.
I love you too, man. Thank you so much.